names tell us things. Names matter. Some names are easily recognizable. For instance, Coke. Coke, if you didn't know it, is sold in over 200 countries in the world. In 200 different countries in the world, you can say the name Coke, and they're going to know what you mean. In fact, there's more countries that sell Coke than there are in the United Nations. Coke is one of those universally recognized names. There are names that when we say them, we associate a slogan with it, right? For instance, if I say the name Subway, you think of, well, yeah, but what slogan would you think of? Eat fresh, thank you very much. You would have really ruined that part of my introduction if you hadn't got that slogan right. Companies, they spend millions of dollars on name recognition, right? They want you to associate their company to certain things. When you have a need or a want for something, they want you to link that need or want to their company. For instance, if you want coffee, Starbucks wants you to think Starbucks, right? If you need a car, Honda wants you to think Honda. If you need a computer, Apple wants you to think of that apple with a bite out of the side of it. They want you to think Apple, computer, Apple. So they spend millions of dollars so that you link the product to the company, to the name. It's not just company names that bring recognition, but there's people's names. When we hear certain people's names, we link it to certain things. If I say the name Bill Gates, you probably think of one of two things, maybe both, Microsoft and money, because he's linked to both of those things, right? If I say the name Barack Obama, you think president, because that's how we know him. We link his name to that office. If I say Tiger Woods, you think professional golf. Done such an amazing job to set his name apart in that field. And so we've got companies, we've got people. Names are important. Names hold meaning. Names are linked to things. It's like the young Native American boy. He was sitting with his father one day, and he looked at him and he asked, "Father, why do we have the names that we do? Why did you name my brother, my sister, and I the names that you named us?" And the father looked off into the distance and he said, "Well, my son, after your mother gave birth, I would walk outside of our tent, and the first thing that I saw would inspire me to give the names that I gave. When your sister was born, I walked outside of our tent and I saw the wind gently blowing through the trees. And so that is why your sister's name is Wind, gently blowing through the trees." He said, "When your brother was born, I walked outside the tent and I saw the raging black clouds of a storm. And that is why your brother is called Raging Black Cloud." And why do you ask this question, puking dog? Names are significant. They hold meaning. They're linked to different things, right? Nobody in their right mind, and I say again, in their right mind, would name their child Hitler or Saddam Hussein, because those names are linked with, they're associated with evil, right? Names are important, they're significant, they tell us things, they bring recognition. And if a company's name is important, if people's names are important, then how much more so is that true of God's name? It's important, and it should link us with certain things. In fact, it's so important, it's so vital, it's so significant that one of the 10 Commandments is dedicated to revering God's name. Exodus 20, verse 7, it says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." The word vain means empty or without value. God's name is so important that He incorporated the reverence and honor of it right in the top 10 commandments. Don't take my name in an empty or a vain way. You can use anybody else's name in an empty or vain way, but don't you dare do that with my name, is what God was saying. That's how important it is. God's name is to be taken seriously because it's associated with who He is. And we're beginning this new series this morning, and over the next several weeks we're going to be looking in the New Testament primarily, and in particular we're going to be spending a lot of time in the Gospel of John, because it's in the Gospel of John that we see Jesus using 7 titles or 7 names in reference to Himself. And they're very significant, not just for us to get the knowledge of what they are and what they mean, but how they work in our lives. In order for us to do that part of our series in the right way, we've got to lay some groundwork this morning, and we're going to spend most of our time in the Old Testament instead of the New Testament, looking at one primary story, because the reality is, if we don't understand the name of God the Father, then we're never going to quite understand the name of God the Son. So this morning we're going to lay the groundwork by looking at this name of God. And so if you have your notes this morning, we are going to start in the Old Testament. Let me give you some background. Keep in mind that God's name isn't God. Do you know that? It's not God. That's a kind of a title. It's kind of His position. It's kind of like president or prime minister or governor. It doesn't tell you about the person and who they are. It tells you the position. God is a position. But God has a name. He has a personal name. And would you put this down under that first bullet point? It occurs over 6,000 times in the Bible. God's name occurs over 6,000 times in the Bible. That's pretty significant. Not just 1 or 2 times it's mentioned, 6,000 times. The first occurrence, the first time we see God's personal name is in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4. It's linked with creation. Listen to what it says. "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven." You say, wait a minute, I think I missed something. All I saw there was Lord God. You said that God wasn't His name, that's His position. Where is it? Well, hold on, because we're going to get there. In many translations, maybe yours, I know mine's like this, if you look at that word Lord in Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, it's in all capital letters. They're kind of small caps, but if you look real close, you'll see that they're all capital letters. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Every time you see that in your translation, that means that the word in the original Hebrew that the Old Testament was translated, that word is the personal name for God. It's been translated capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, but that's not really what it means. It's God's personal name. And would you put this down on the next bullet point? No one is quite sure how to pronounce it. You say, what? What are you talking about? I don't know how to pronounce it. I mean, we got Bible scholars and doctors and PhDs, and they can't figure out how to pronounce God's name. Well, let me give you just a little idea of why that is. In Hebrew, originally, there was no vowels. When you read Hebrew, you would only read consonants. Now, I know it's been a while since some of you were in school, so let me remind you. A, E, I, O, U, those are vowels, right? Okay. Everything else is called a consonant. You go, oh yeah, okay, that's why I fail English. But here's the reality. In Hebrew, there was never any vowels. You know how hard it is to read English? And we have vowels and consonants? In Hebrew, there was no vowels. They were understood. You say, how did that work? I'm not really sure, but it worked for them, and that's the way they did it. So you would come across these 4 consonants. Y, H, W, H. In Hebrew. And of course, Hebrew alphabet's different than our alphabet, but the corresponding letters. Y, H, W, H. And so they would come across, this was God's name. But here was the problem. The Hebrews considered the name of God so sacred, so special, and they took that command in Exodus 20 so seriously not to take God's name in vain, that they wouldn't pronounce His name out loud in fear that somehow they would dishonor the name of God. And so for years, the name of God wasn't pronounced. Every time they came to the name of God in a public setting and they were going to read it, instead of saying God, they would replace it with the word Adonai. And Adonai in Hebrew means Lord. So if they were in a public setting like we are this morning in the synagogue and they were reading from the Old Testament and they came across that name, they wouldn't pronounce it. They would just simply say Adonai. And everybody who was hearing the reading of the word would know, oh, they just came to the name. In fact, what took place is, over time, that's how God was referred to. His name was referred to as the name. I mean, how would you like to be known as the name? You know? Some of you are old enough to remember a singer by the name of Prince. Remember Prince? Prince changed his name to whatever that symbol was. Nobody could pronounce it, but that was his new name. And eventually he changed it back to Prince because nobody knew what to do with that. But the reality is, God has a name that was so sacred to the Hebrews, they never pronounced it. And it came to a point where they would just refer to the name. And so over time, eventually, long about the 10th century, what they did in the Hebrew is they added what are called vowel pointings. And I don't want to get too technical here, but if you saw a Hebrew word, you would have a Hebrew word listed. It would just be consonants, but under each one of those letters, if there was a vowel that was supposed to follow, like O, there was a particular pointing or symbol that was underneath that letter to say that that was the next sound that was supposed to happen. So by the 10th century, these were just kind of triggers so that as you were reading, you would know what sound would come and you wouldn't have to wonder or guess anymore. The problem is that by the 10th century, the name of God hadn't been spoken for centuries. And so nobody knew how to say it, and we had the consonants, but we didn't know quite what the vowels were. And so what somebody decided to do a long time ago is they took the vowels from the word Adonai and they plugged them into the YHWH. And what they came up with was a Yehovah, or what we know as Jehovah. But as scholars started looking at it closer, they said, no, that's not quite right for this reason and for that reason. And most Bible scholars believe today that the name of God, the personal name of God, is closer to the name Yahweh. Yahweh. That's His personal name. And let me just add this. This is just simply to give you an idea of how serious the Hebrews took the name and how vital it was even in translating the Old Testament. There were no Xerox machines, 4,000 years ago. There was no printing presses. The only way that Scripture could be handed off to somebody is if it was hand copied. The Hebrews took this very seriously, and they had scribes that were assigned literally to take and copy Scripture down, make copies of it. Now, I don't know how you do copying if you ever have to copy something, but the way I do it is I try to get as many words as I can in my head so that when I go down to the paper I can write 3 or 4 words at a time, right? And then I go next, okay? The way the Hebrew scribes did it is, and they were trained this way, they were taught this way, one letter at a time. So it'd be like this. L, L, O, O, R, R, D, D. Can you imagine how long that took? Now, add to that this. The name of God was so sacred. The name Yahweh was so sacred. Not only did they not pronounce it, every time a scribe came to that name, he would put down his writing quill. He would go and take a ceremonial bath, completely washing himself. He would come back, he would write the name one letter at a time, then he would destroy the pen that that name was written with and throw it away. That's how sacred it was. Now stop and think about that. That name appears over 6,000 times in the Old Testament. That's a lot of pens. That's a lot of baths. That's one clean bug out, I got to tell you right there. But do you see, you say, well, why the detail? Because it was so sacred. It was so special. Now let me tell you this. That also tells you how vital it was in their minds that they copy the Scriptures correctly. That's why when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, they were so sure, now we're going to see all the discrepancies. We're going to take these Dead Sea Scrolls that are the latest, the furthest back that we have of the Bible, and we're going to lay them up against the ones that we have now. Now we're going to see the discrepancies, because everybody knows that people make mistakes when they copy things down, and what they discovered is they were spot on, even though they were hundreds and hundreds of years apart. And it's because these guys were so meticulous and took so much time in making sure that every letter was right. And every time they came to that sacred name of God, man, they took it so seriously. They went and go take a bath, destroy their pen, and start all over again. Now stop and think, take that kind of reverence with the kind of flippancy we take with God's name today. I mean, it's amazing to me. Even Christian folk who will say things like, oh my God, just off the cuff. It makes me cringe when I hear it. You go, yeah, well, that's his title. It's not really his name. Well, I realize that, but if they knew his name, they'd be using that too. You say, well, how do you know? Because they take the name of Jesus in vain all the time. I mean, when's the last time you heard anybody say, oh, sweet holy Muhammad? Nobody takes Muhammad's name in vain. If you did, they'd look at you like you were an idiot. What is that? You know, just swear like everybody else. Take Jesus' name in vain. What are you talking about Muhammad for? When's the last time somebody hit their thumb with a hammer and just, oh, Buddha. Oh. Buddha, that hurts. Why are you're laughing? Because nobody does it. But when someone says, oh, Jesus Christ, you don't laugh. You may cringe a little bit. You don't laugh because it's common and everybody does it. But take that with the seriousness of the way these scribes dealt with the name of God. That last bullet point there is this. It is the personal name of God. Listen to what it says in Psalm 68:4. Sing to God, sing praises to His name, lift up a song for Him who rides through the deserts. Listen, whose name is, here it is, the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. His name is Yahweh, and exalt before Him. That's His personal name. Yahweh is His name. Another side note just popped into my head. I have these discussions with our Jehovah's Witnesses friends periodically, because they'll come and, they'll start trying to teach their doctrine. I'll say, well, the interesting thing is, you guys are so hung up on Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah. Did you know that's probably not His name? Huh? And we have some great conversations, because they're never told that. They're never told some of these things. And see, that just really rocks them, because, wow, we've got the truth. We've got it all down. And when they realize, oh, wow, I don't know, I guess I better go back and talk to somebody about that, because I don't know how to answer that. And see, the reality is God has a name, folks. We need to know it. But more importantly, we need to know what it means. And so I've already told you this morning that we find it first mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, and then we see his name mentioned all throughout the book of Genesis. But I want to zero in on a passage this morning in Exodus, the next book, because this really kind of gives us a better idea of God's name and what it means. So if you have your mark there in Exodus chapter 3, I want to read this story to you, and let me give you some background. This is the story of Moses and the burning bush, and some of you are familiar with this story. Moses, if you remember, was born to Hebrew slaves. The Israelites were in Egypt. They had multiplied. They had gotten there because there was a famine in Israel, and they came to Egypt. That's a whole other story, but all you need to know this morning is that they were there, and over a period of 400 years, they multiplied to over 1 million people. So now there's 1 million Jewish refugees in Egypt. They've been there for 400 years. They went from being friends of the Pharaoh when they first came in to the Pharaoh's changing over time, not recognizing them anymore as a legitimate friend, and they made them slaves. And many historians believe today that that's how the pyramids were built, with Jewish slave labor. And so the Jews are here, they're in slavery, and in the process of this, they're growing tremendously. The Pharaoh comes along and he says, hey, we can't have this. We get too many of these Jewish people, they're going to outnumber us and they're going to take us over. And so the Pharaoh came up with a law and he said, okay, this is the law. From now on, any Jewish woman that gives birth to a male baby, that baby is to be thrown in the river. And if you know anything about the Nile River, it's full of crocodiles. So it was instant death. The baby was either going to drown or he was going to be eaten. Well, Moses had some parents that said, no, we can't do that. That's just, we got to leave this baby in God's hands. And so the mother made a basket, stuck the baby in the basket. And if you're familiar with the story or you saw the movie, the basket goes down the Nile River. Moses' older sister's watching it. Here's Pharaoh's daughter taking a bath in the river. Here comes the basket. She hears the cry. She opens it up, falls in love. Oh, I want to raise this baby. She decides to make the baby her own, but she knows she needs some help. Moses' sister hears and sees this all, runs up to her and says, hey, I know the perfect person to be your nurse. Runs back to mom, and Moses' mom becomes his nurse as Pharaoh's mom becomes his stepmother. Moses grows up, he's taught the best because he grows up as Pharaoh's grandson. He learns all the best things. He's educated in all the best ways. But he still knows, because his mom has been his nurse all these years, he knows that he's really Jewish. He knows that God is the God of the Jews, that Yahweh is the God of the Jews. And so he's wrestling with this Egyptian upbringing and the fact that he's Jewish. And long about that time, he finds himself out looking at different things out in the kingdom, and he sees a slave being beaten by a master, and he just snaps, and he goes and he kills the master and buries his body in sand. Well, the word gets back to the Pharaoh, and next thing you know, Moses is literally running for his life. He runs out into the desert. He ends up becoming a nomadic shepherd for 40 years. He's no longer in line for being Pharaoh. He's no longer living in the palace. He's now living in the desert. It's hot, it's dusty, it's dry. Think West End in August. Okay? Outside with sheep. That's what he's up against every day of his life. 40 years of that. I can't hardly stand 40 minutes of it. And Moses lives in this for 40 years. That's where we pick up our story in chapter 3. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord, I don't know what you have in your translation, but mine's capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Yahweh appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. It was no new thing in that kind of a climate, in that kind of a situation, to see a bush on fire. That happened all the time. It was the desert. This was different. There was a bush. with leaves, with branches. And there was a fire. But the bush wasn't being consumed by the fire. There were flames in the bush, but the bush remained a bush. It wasn't shriveling up, turning black, smoke coming off of it. And so Moses is seeing this thing going, whoa. Verse 3, so Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush isn't burned up. Well, yeah, he's not used to that. I got to go check this out. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush, and he said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Now, we lose something sometimes in these stories because it's just kind of giving us the facts. The bush is talking to Moses. You got to know, he's startled. Seeing bushes on fire was a common thing. Seeing bushes on fire but not being consumed wasn't common. And hearing voices come out of bushes that are on fire not being consumed is really weird stuff. So Moses hears this voice. I mean, he might have looked around going, is one of the sheep? What is going on here? Here I am. Here I am. Then he said, verse 5, do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Why was it holy? Was there something special about it? Was it glowing? Was it white? Did it have a halo on it somewhere? It was holy because it was set apart for God to show up to Moses right there. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this. So he looks at it. Verse 6. He also said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So now Moses is terrified. Not only is the bush talking to him, not only is it on fire and not being consumed, this voice has identified itself as God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them up from the land to a good and a spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. God says, Moses, look, I want you to know who I am. I am the same God that was around for your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I want you also to know, Moses, that those brothers of yours, those relatives of yours, that nation of yours, Israel, I've seen what's been going on for the last 400 years. I haven't been asleep. I've seen the oppression that they're going through, and I've come down to do something about it. Now, at this point, you got to know, Moses is going, well, this is great. Wow, great, God, nice, good. And I'm sure maybe he's thinking in his mind, why is he telling me? Why is he filling me in on this? I mean, this is nice, but I'm just a shepherd here in the field, just trying to make a living, trying to make things happen. Why is God showing up and telling me he's going to do this? Verse 10, therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Oh, Moses, by the way, this is why I'm telling you this, because you're the man. I'm sending you to Pharaoh. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? God, come on, God. I tried that 40 years ago and it didn't work. It got me in big trouble. Who am I, God? Look what God says to him. And he said, certainly I will be with you. And this shall be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at the mountain. Then Moses said to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? Here's the key, folks. What shall I say to them? Moses says, okay, God, let's suppose this all works out the way you're telling me, and I go to the Pharaoh, and I go to the children of Israel and say, look, guys, God's chosen me to help you get free from slavery and to get out from underneath the bondage of Egypt. And he goes, what happens if they ask me, God who? What's his name? See, you got to understand something. In the context of where this was taking place, the people surrounding Israel, they worshipped multiple gods. The Egyptians worshiped multiple gods. In fact, you're familiar with the 10 plagues? Each one of those plagues was to cast doubt on one of the different gods that the Egyptians worshipped. The god of the Nile, the god of the frogs, the god of the flies, and so forth. So those weren't just random. I don't know, you might have seen it and go, wow, why did God use frogs? Why did he use gnats? Why did he use, because it was a specific pronouncement. I am more powerful than the phony God that you serve, is what it was. So they worship multiple gods. So Moses shows up and he says to the people, God has sent me to be your deliverer. And Moses said, they're going to ask me, God who? Which one? The God of the flies? The God of the frogs? The God of the Nile? Which God are you talking about? Now look what God says to him. He says, verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. You go, whoa. What on earth does that mean? I am that I am. Tell them I am has sent you. So Moses is supposed to go to the Israelites and say, here I am. I'm the shepherd from the wilderness, the guy that saw the bush burning and not burning up, the guy that heard the bush talking to me. It happened to be the Lord that said to me, come and be your deliverer. And they're going to say to me, who, which God, which one are we supposed to know sent you? And I'm supposed to say, tell them I am sent you? What is that all about? Well, folks, that was this personal name of God. That is what the word Yahweh means. It means the present one, the I am. It's in the imperfect tense here, and you go, well, what does that mean? You're throwing English out at me again. Well, listen, this is very important. An imperfect tense means that something that started in the past continues in the present, but will not be complete until sometime in the future. God was describing himself in the best terms that Moses could understand. He says, you tell them, I am Yahweh, I am. That's what he was saying. You say, wow, you think Moses got all of that? You think he understood the depths of what God was saying there? No. I don't think he did. I think that was just going to come further on in his life. It's kind of like a child, a baby, when they first started using the word mama. You don't really think they know exactly what that means, do you? I know all the moms in here want to think that they do. Mama to a little one means bottle, means change me, means pay attention to me, means play with me. They don't understand for some time that mama means protection, care, love. It takes a while for them to associate that name, that word, with those things. Moses didn't understand all of the depth of what this name was going to mean, but he would eventually. Just like you may be sitting here this morning going, I'm not really sure I understand all this and why it's so important. And hopefully in just a few minutes you will, because what God wants to say to you this morning is exactly what he was saying to Moses and the people of Israel thousands of years ago. He is the I am. He is the I am. You say, what does that mean? Would you put this down? He's the God who was. He's the God who was. See, verse 15 summarizes all that God was trying to say to Moses. God furthermore said to Moses, verse 15, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He was saying to Moses, look, I want you to go and tell them I am Yahweh, I am. I was the God of the past. I am the God of your forefathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because, see, it was going to be very important for them to know. They had been talking about this God for all the hundreds of years that they were in Egypt. That it's going to be important for them to know that this God sent Moses. The God that showed up to Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12, called him out of the country of Ur and said, I'm going to make you a great nation. Even though Abraham didn't have any children. Abraham was childless. He was 75 25 years old when God shows up and says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Abraham says, shoot, sounds good to me. It wasn't for 25 more years that God came through on his promise. Abraham's 100. His wife Sarah is 90. They still don't have the promised child. They're ready to give up. God shows up, gives them the child, and the child was Isaac. And see, you got to know, that story was huge to the Israelites because that was their beginning. Abraham was their father. And so to know that the same God that brought forth Isaac out of Abraham and Sarah when there's no way they should ever had a child, the God of the impossible, that same impossibilities that we sang about this morning on that first song, this is the kind of God that they were going to need to know. The God of Abraham, the God who provided for Isaac, and the God who provided for Jacob as well, your forefathers. Jacob's son Joseph, who ended up in Egypt, who was the one that God used to preserve the Israelites during the terrible famine. That's how they ended up in Egypt anyway. And so when Moses shows up and he says, God has sent me, and they say to him, God who? And he says, the God of your fathers, Yahweh. What he was saying is the God that took care of people in the past. See, folks, I don't know about you, but I read some of these stories in the Bible and I go, wow, that is cool. I mean, I read about the parting of the Red Sea. I don't know, but I kind of have this imagination that someday when we're in heaven, there's going to be this huge flat screen. And we can ask God, hey, God, you know that whole Red Sea thing? Can you show that again? I'd like to. Could you slow it down this time? Because I really want to see that whole. I think we're going to be able to see some of these great things in history. Would you go back and look at them? And man, that's one of them I'd love to see. I'd love to see the whole ark thing, man. I mean, that just kind of blows my mind. I would love to see, because the only ones that saw it were the soldiers that were on guard that morning. I would love to see when the stone rolled away and Jesus came out of the grave. I'd love to see that. I read these things and I go, wow, God is amazing. Really what I'm saying is God was amazing. God was amazing. Wasn't he? He was amazing. And we need to be reminded about what God has done. Some of you, though, the problem is that's where you live. You live in the God of the past. You not only look back and you go, God was, man, he did some great things in the Bible. And then we go, wait a minute, how about your life? Oh yeah, he did some great things in my life too. Some of you can talk about the salvation that you got. You can talk about the life that you had before Christ and how messed up you were and the things that you were involved in. And you can remember with great fondness, man, I remember the day that I said yes to Jesus and how my life began to change. And it wasn't overnight, but I saw how God was moving and working in me. And you look back and you go, man, God has done some great things in my life. But that's where you park. That's where you're sitting. You're sitting in the past. You're like the guy who graduated from high school 40 years ago, and he keeps talking about the championship that he won with the team that he was with 40 years ago. Nobody cares. You're an old fart now. Who cares? But so many of us live our Christian lives like that. It's important that we're reminded about the God of the past, that he's done some great things, and he's done some great things in our life, and it's great, and we should rehearse those, but don't live there. If God is just the God of the past, yeah, I remember when he did that for me, and I remember, when he did that for me, and man, there's some great stories in the Bible. That's really good. God said to Moses, he said, when you show up and they ask you which God, you tell them Yahweh, you tell him I am. I am refers to the idea that he's the God of the past, but it encompasses more than that. The people of Israel were going to need to know that the God of the past who provided for their fathers, he was the one that was going to be with them, and he was with Moses, and he had them right there. But that's not all that this name means. It's not just about the God of the past. Would you put this down? It's the God who is. Who is. Verse 15 goes on. He says, after you tell him that I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you tell him that it's me who has sent me to you. In other words, Moses, you let them know that although I'm the God of the past who watched over your fathers and provided for your fathers, I am the God right now, Moses, who has sent you to do this work today. I'm not just the God about back then. I'm a God that's doing stuff right now. Would you put this down? I am the God of the present reality. See, here's the problem. If the people just knew that God was the God of the past and provided for their forefathers, they could say, well, yeah, He did it for them back then, but where's He been for 400 years? He hasn't been around here for 400 years. I mean, we haven't seen Him. He hasn't talked to anybody. He hasn't freed us from slavery. In fact, things just seem to be getting worse and worse. Where is God now? And Moses was supposed to remind them, God was not just about the God who was with some people in the past and did great things in the past. He was a God right there in their present. In fact, when God calls Moses, before he even gets to the fact that he was going to use Moses, he says, Moses, I have seen and I have heard the people. And what he was saying to Moses is, look, I haven't been asleep. I haven't been on vacation. I haven't been away somewhere and oblivious. I know what's going on. I'm a God in the present and the God of right now, and I see what's happening. And you go, well, why do you think God let him sit for 400 years? I don't know exactly. But I know that His timing is God's timing. And He does what He does for a purpose and a plan and a reason, not just out of a whim. And so you may be sitting in a situation right now and you go, where's God? You know, I've been calling out for Him. He's done some great things for me in the past. I know He saved me in the past. I know He's redeemed me. But man, I'm in this mess right now, and where is He? And I'm here to tell you this morning that He's Yahweh. He's I Am. He's the God of the present reality. And He may not step into your situation right now because it's not time. You say, but it seems like it is. I think it is. Are you God? Can you see it all? I was talking with some folks the other day. They stopped by to see me. I never actually met them before. It was a guy that had written me a few years ago, and they'd been visiting Ireland, and they heard about our wrestling team here. And so anyway, long and short of it, he writes me a letter and says, hey, you got any T-shirts? I'd love to have a Molokai wrestling T-shirt. And so I sent him a T-shirt. And figured that was the end of it. Well, that was 4 or 5 years ago. They show up. The other day, they show up. And I don't know if you want another T-shirt, but he shows up and says, hey, I'm so-and-so, and you sent me a T-shirt a few years ago. And so we were having a good talk. And somewhere in the talk, we were talking about their trip, where they were going, and they said they eventually were going to end up in Honolulu, and they kind of rolled their eyes around and said, we're only spending 2 days there. We can't wait to get out of there. And I said, yeah, you and all the rest of us, you know. I mean, you drive on Oahu. I grew up in the city, folks. I grew up on freeways, but not the craziness that's across the channel. That is just nuts. And you know, when they give the traffic reports in the morning, you know, there's some guy in a helicopter, and he's flying over all these different places, and he's reporting down to the ground, hey, you know, tell people there's an accident on H1 at this place and this place. Tell people to avoid this street over here because there's an accident. There's a car broken down over here. And he's seeing all this stuff. Now, the guy in the car is supposed to take that information and go, okay, avoid that street. Let's make sure we go this way this morning instead of the normal way so that he doesn't get caught in traffic. Now, how about if the guy's listening to all this stuff and going, just some guy in a helicopter, what's he know? He didn't know what's going on. He's going to end up not only stuck in traffic, but helping to clog everybody else's morning too with the traffic that's going on, right? The guy in the helicopter has a better vantage point of what's going on. He might be driving down the freeway and going, what is he talking about? Traffic's backed up on H1. I'm on H1. We're flowing. It's no big... Turn him off. And about a mile down the road, all of a sudden, comes to a screeching halt because the accident was further than he could see down the road. See, God has a much better vantage point than you and I have. And we're sitting there going, wait a minute, God, it needs to take place right now. You need to take me out of this mess right now. You need to stop whatever this is right now, God. I know what's best. And God's up there at a better vantage point going, no, you don't. Trust me, you don't know. This is not the time. See, God is not just the God of the past. These people were going to need to know that He was the God of the right now. He saw, He heard, He was aware, He was a God of the present. And folks, I want to tell you this morning, He is the I Am. He is Yahweh. He's God of right now. And wrapped up in that name is not only the idea that he was God the past, the God of the present, but he was also, would you put this down, the God who will be. The end of verse 15 says this. God says, this is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. All of that's wrapped up in his name. The idea that he was the God of their forefathers, the God of the past. He was the God that was sending Moses right now. I'm the God of the present, and he is the God of future certainty. Sometimes I think what happens is we forget that God has a plan down the road. It's not just about this life. We look to try to get all we can in this life and be as comfortable as we can and make all the best strides that we can in this life. Folks, this is not all there is. You and I were made for eternity. This is temporal. This is short. And yes, we need to do the best that we can to be all that God wants us to be, but we need to keep in mind that God is the God of the future, the certain future. He's got a plan, he says in his word, a plan to do good and not to harm you. And wrapped up in this name Yahweh, this personal name, this holy name, is this idea that he's the God of the past, he's the God of the present, he's the God of the future. That's why he says, I am. I am right now. Always was, always will be, is what that name means. It is full. It's rich. And you say, well, you know, I never really realized that, number one, God had a personal name, and I never really realized there was that much packed in it. Does it really make that much of a difference that I know all of that? And the reality is this. Knowing God, and part of what comes from knowing God, determines how you're going to relate to him and how he's going to relate to you. Listen what it says in James 4:8. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. See, look, here's the reality, folks. It's hard to really worship a God that you don't know. If I'm not knowing much about him, why would I give him praise and honor and worship? It's hard to really serve a God that you don't really know. I mean, I don't really know this God. Why should I serve him? It's hard to really love a God that you don't know. And ultimately, it's really hard to trust a God that you don't know. And part of knowing God is knowing what's wrapped up in his name, knowing what and who he's all about, that he's this God of past, present, future. And as you look at your life, you can look back and you can go, yeah, I can see God's done this, this, and this, but you've got to know that God is right there right now, and he's going to be there down the road. He's always going to be there. You know how important that was for the Israelites to know that? They're getting ready to step out with this guy that they knew of, because they'd heard of him 40 years before, but this guy's now telling them that God, Yahweh, sent them, and that they're supposed to believe him, go before the Pharaoh, and ask Pharaoh to set them free. And even if Pharaoh does set them free, they're having to put all their trust in the fact that he really heard from God. They've got to believe that this God was the same God that did all the amazing things for their forefathers, the same God that was going to walk with them right now, and the same God that was going to give them a future in a land called Israel. They had to believe all of that if they were going to walk out in faith. And folks, my point this morning is you and I got to believe the same thing if we're going to walk in faith today. That he's that God. Now, there was one more point on your notes this morning, but we're going to stop right there. And we'll pick this up next week. But let me say this. You cannot know Jesus the way that you need to until you understand that God is the I am. He is Yahweh. He is the very God that you and I need right now. The one who was, back then, maybe back in your future, if you've placed, or back in your past, if you placed your faith and trust in him. But he's also the God that's going to be with you and stay by you all the way through life and into eternity. He is the great I am. And you will never understand his work in the person of Jesus Christ until you begin to grasp all of who God is in that name, the I Am. So you're sitting here this morning, and I don't know what you're going through, but God does. Just like He said to Moses, hey, I've heard the cries of Israel. I've seen what's been going on. I know what's happening in their life. He could say the same thing about you today. He's heard your cries. He's seen what's going on in your life. And I'm here to tell you, He's not just a God that's up there somewhere. He's a very present help in time of need. He's the God of right now who wants to do something in your life. Would you bow your heads, please, and close your eyes?